I've got a new book out called Rebuilding the Executive about the federal government, but more on that later. Today I want to talk about two things: how lobbying works in the executive branch and Frank the farmer. Lobbyists are basically the boogeyman of every talking head and political pundit. And there's good reason for that. Don't worry, we'll get there. But there's also valid reasons for lobbyists to exist. Calm down, forget about your pitchforks for a minute, and allow me to explain. The United States is a republic built on the idea of representation. We have congresspersons who represent a single district, a local area, and the population and industries within it. We have the Senate, which represents an entire state and does so equally against other states. And then we have the president, which represents the nation as a whole. This is why diplomacy and the military are under the president's authority, and why the president should probably be decided by popular vote. But that's a whole can of worms for another day. This tiered system of representation is a good thing, even if it leads to some frustrating consequences. We may not like it when some backwoods town is holding up the fight against climate change, or when members of Congress pass subsidies for industries like coal that we may find harmful to the nation overall. But for that congressperson and the people they represent, coal may be vital to their economy. It may be the difference between prosperity and poverty in that region. So how do lobbyists fit into this picture? Remember last week when we talked about the dairy industry? Well, there are dairy farms in more than one congressional district and more than one state. The lobbyists give that industry a singular voice on the national stage. And it isn't just industries. Special interest groups can give a voice to everything from conservation to climate change to gun rights or anything else people care about. This is ultimately a good thing. It's a sign of a healthy republic and can help avoid some nasty unintended consequences. Using our milk example from last week, let's say the government is considering writing a sweeping law that will usher in new standards for milk harvesting, processing, and storage. Only members of Congress with dairy farms in their district are likely to care. However, milk is something that affects the entire nation. Those new regulations could bring unintended costs to farming operations, leading to higher prices or a shortage of supply. Lobbyists can act as a singular voice, not only representing the dairy farmers, but providing much-needed expertise on the issue. They can help Congress, or the executive, craft that legislation in a way that gives the intended outcome without adversely affecting the dairy industry unnecessarily. There's nothing wrong with the ideals behind lobbying. The problem largely comes in with campaign contributions, essentially bribes, to certain politicians. This shifts the politicians' loyalty from their district to the industries bankrolling them. But that has less to do with the concept of lobbying and more with the failure of Congress. It's not lobbying that's the problem, it's the corruption. That's great for theory, but how does it work in practice? Well, as you've guessed, it all comes down to money. Lobbying groups don't have voters, but they do have shareholders. In order to keep their jobs, they have to keep those shareholders happy and earn their paychecks, which means doing everything they can to make their shareholders more money. This can take several forms. Sometimes it's what we already discussed: lobbyists helping to make sure the restrictions on a given business aren't too disruptive. Other times it means arguing that programs meant to pay out to certain groups pays more, or that a given commodity is included in a certain program. Again, there's nuance here, both good and bad, so let's look at some examples. Both of the following examples are true. I witnessed them firsthand when I worked at USDA. The first example is about grapes. You may remember a few years ago when wildfires were burning half the country. Well, a lot of farms and livestock were killed in those fires. This led to the Wildfire and Hurricane Indemnity Program, or WHIP. The specifics of the program are complicated, but basically it meant the government was going to pay farmers for the damages they suffered from those severe weather events. So if some of your cows died in a wildfire or your orange grove got wiped out by a hurricane, the government would cut you a check. I'm still mad they didn't call it the Hell or High Water program, but you gotta pick your battles. So grapes. The grapes in this instance weren't burned down in the fires, and so weren't initially covered by the program. The grape lobby, I think in this case it was mostly wineries, argued that the smoke from those fires got into the grapes and damaged them beyond use. Even though the fire wasn't on their land, the farmers were just as damaged as everyone else, and so they thought they should get to participate in the program. Okay, there's some logic to that. You can see how the government would side with that lobbying group and include them in the program, which they did. The goal of the program was to help farmers hurt by natural disasters stay in business and avoid severe price fluctuations in their given commodities. The grape farmers fit both definitions and were able to apply for the same benefits. And theoretically, the industry was able to continue without unexpected price hikes or other nasty side effects. Then there's example 2. USDA also had a program for paying farmers to conserve grasslands. The underlying logic was pretty simple. Farmers want to farm their fields so they can earn a living. However, extensive farming in certain areas can lead to soil degradation and other environmental effects. The government doesn't want the land farmed to help keep the soil healthy overall and to protect certain endangered species. So the government created a program to pay farmers not to farm their land. It sounds ridiculous when spoken out loud, but there's a certain logic to the program, even if you don't agree with it. And then the golf course lobby showed up. Yep, golf courses have their own lobby. And the golf course lobby argued that they too owned grasslands that they weren't farming. You know, because people were playing golf on them. The golf course lobby argued that they fit the definition of the program and should be included. And you know what? They were successful. The government allowed them into the program, and taxpayer dollars meant for conservation went to golf courses. Now that almost certainly came down to corruption at some level. It's pretty blatant that it's not what the program was intended for. But I wanted to give an illustration of how two lobbying groups can interact with the government. Some for good, logical reasons, and some for greedy, less logical reasons. In both of these instances, the groups were after money for their shareholders, and in both instances, the lobbyists represented groups that cut across congressional or state lines. And in both instances, the executive branch had to decide what the right course of action was. Like we talked about in last week's dairy problem video, every industry and every sector has issues just like this, as do certain public causes. For every grape or golf course lobbyist that came by, there were lobbyists fighting for clean technologies or to save certain endangered species. So why does the government, in this case the executive branch, even bother listening to these people? After all, the executive branch isn't coming up for election outside the president, in the same way that members of Congress are. Lobbying groups can't simply cut a check to a secretary or undersecretary as easily as they can members of Congress. So why meet with them in the first place? That brings us to Frank the Farmer. Frank the Farmer, unlike other examples in this video, is made up. He unfortunately does not exist. But we're going to use him to explain how companies use innocent people as a Trojan horse to meet with the government. Let's imagine there's a huge scandal in the lemonade industry. There's an outbreak of disease that leads to a lot of people getting sick from that lemonade, or someone opens a bottle only to find someone's severed finger floating in it. You know, something that'll get a lot of headlines and therefore requires the government to pretend like it cares. Congress does what Congress does best, passing some knee-jerk but ultimately toothless legislation demanding the lemonade industry practice better cleanliness and have higher safety standards. The actual nuts and bolts, what those practices or standards entail, aren't determined by Congress. Instead, it goes over to the executive, in this case USDA, to formulate regulations and figure out just how clean really is. Meanwhile, Bob's Lemonade Emporium is the biggest lemonade producer in the country. They make billions of dollars a year buying lemons, squeezing lemonade into plastic bottles, and selling those bottles in stores all across the nation. Bob's Lemonade Emporium also happens to own several of the plants that led to the initial outbreak of disease in the first place. It was one of their employees who lost their finger. The Emporium has been cutting costs for decades, skipping out on training, cleaning supplies, or modern equipment in order to maximize profits for their shareholders and bonuses for their executives. These new standards are going to cost the Emporium millions, maybe even tens of millions of dollars in order to catch up to the new requirements. This is going to make their shareholders very, very unhappy. They need a way out. But Bob's Emporium has a problem. This is a big news story. There's a lot of public attention. If this billion-dollar company shows up and demands the government let them off easy, the public is going to find out. This could lead to the public putting pressure on Congress or the president, which in turn can lead to even harsher regulations, boycotts, or other nastiness the Emporium doesn't want to deal with. So the Emporium gets clever. They go find Frank the farmer. Frank grew up on a lemonade farm with his father, selling the juice he squeezed in his grandmother's kitchen to help get by. When Frank's father died, he used the modest inheritance to set up a juice shop in Main Street, Middle America, where he works with his wife and 2 daughters, squeezing lemonade by hand to thirsty customers, just like the old days. Frank's shop is a small, family-owned business. They only make about $50,000 a year in profit. They save money where they can, but the money just doesn't go as far as it used to. It won't be enough to pay for the new cleaning supplies, monitoring equipment, or safety gear that these newfangled regulations will require. Why, it might just put poor Frank out of business. Bob's Lemonade Emporium tells Frank they're on his side. They want to help poor Frank deliver his message to the fat cats in Washington. They'll get him an appointment with the USDA. They'll even cover his airfare and coach him on what to say. And now, a billion-dollar company has the government trapped. If the USDA refuses to meet with Frank the farmer, the company will use their wealth and influence to get Frank on every major news station in the country, telling his sob story about how these regulations are going to put his family out of business. If the government relents, then the billion-dollar company will make sure Frank gets his meeting. When Frank shows up in Washington, he'll be accompanied by a dozen lobbyists and lawyers who are going to do most of the talking. Frank will barely get a word in. Frank is a prop one lobbyist used to great effect against the government. Frank's congressman can't say no to a meeting with Frank and still hope to get reelected. And the executive can't say no for a fear of a scandal or looking like they don't care. The company uses Frank as an act for political theater, pushing for lessened safety regulations, loopholes, and exemptions. Anything to dull the otherwise sharp teeth of the new regulations. And you know what? It might actually help Frank. It might make sure Frank stays in business. But it also helps that billion-dollar company not have to buy as much safety equipment, not have to spend money on new machines or anything else. But there's one final bit of insidiousness to how this whole thing works, and it's one that tips things in favor of the lobbyists. Congress can lobby the executive, can put pressure on the way they implement certain programs, either through legislation or the budget. And lobby groups can lobby both Congress and the executive. But the executive can lobby neither. This means that not only can lobbying groups apply direct pressure to the executive, but it can apply secondary leverage through Congress. The executive can't direct a business what to do outside of the law, as that would exceed their constitutional authority. And the executive has to be subservient to Congress. Otherwise, you don't have a republic, you have a dictatorship. The end result is a system in which those least accountable to the electorate, the lobbyists, have the most influence, and the branch of government which represents the nation as a whole has the least. Not only does the executive branch have to deal with the pressure from Bob's Lemonade Emporium directly, they have to also deal with the pressure the Emporium applies through the senators and congresspersons allied with them. When we think about lobbyists and their corruption, we mostly think about Congress and campaign contributions. And those are absolutely problems that need addressing. But the influence of lobbying goes far beyond that. Lobbyists have their fingers on the scale from well before legislation is drafted all the way through to that program being implemented and carried out by the executive branch. We need to be aware of not just their corruption, but how the very structure of these systems benefits lobbies above that of the taxpayer. After all, the oaths of office sworn by members of government are meant to protect the citizenry, not the share price of some company. If you want to know more about the day-to-day structure of government and how these issues come about, consider picking up my new book. Rebuilding the Executive is about how our executive branch functions, the limitations it currently faces, and how we can fix some of those problems. It's available now on Google Play and Amazon Kindle. Every bit of support helps the channel grow. The more books you buy, the more videos I can make. That's just math. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.